Well, welcome. It's good to have you all this evening, and particularly to welcome Roy Wiliams. It's great to have you with us, Roy.
Lovely to be here, mate.
I got to know you a little while ago when you came and spoke at our men's breakfast.
I remember it well.
In fact, I think at that point you had only just published Post-God Nation.
Yes, that's right.
Okay.
It's come out in 2015.
Okay, because that was that's your third book.
That's right.
And then since then, you've actually published another book, which is Mystery Eternity. And we're going to get to that a little bit later in our little conversation. But let's start at the beginning. And so what made you want to become a writer? I mean, why did you start writing?
Well, writing was in the blood. I came from a family of journalists. My father was an eminent journalist. My brother's a journalist. I was the odd man out. I was a lawyer, and practiced that for 20 years. And I got rather ill, got very ill, and left the law. I started writing really as a form of therapy, get my own thoughts straight about my Christian faith. I converted midlife at the age of 35, and I really didn't start writing for the purpose of writing a book. It just turned into a book. This one, God, actually my first, which is an apologetic defence of the Christian faith. To initially my family and friends. I wasn't brought up in a Christian home, ethical and intellectual, but not Christian. And most of my friends in the legal world were not Christians. A lot of people looked at me rather strangely when I converted. And why you? Well, I tried to explain myself.
Okay.
In that book.
So how did that conversion take place? I mean, was it a miraculous Damascus road, or was it something a bit more subtle?
It was a bit more subtle, though I did have a Damascus experience 2 years later. Look, initially it was as simple as this. I decided my daughter, who was then 4, Hope, is her name, should go to Sunday school. Because I'd gone to Sunday school. It just seemed like the thing to do. I'd get a free Sunday morning. So I took her down to the local Presbyterian church. That was my religious heritage, such as it was, on my father's side. And turned up there one Sunday morning, in 1998. They welcomed us, but they said, "We don't really like parents just ditching their children at the door and then leaving. One of you please stay." I stayed, and very, very quickly I got interested. Just sitting up the back listening and dipping into the Bible in the pew. It was more reading and I just love the fellowship, but being the sort of person I am, I got intellectually interested at first and realised I was very ignorant of Christianity.
Yeah, as I've looked at all the different books that you've done, what seems to fascinate you is people's stories, kind of the way in which different people kind of understand their faith and the way in which that faith is lived out. I mean, we're not going to make any lawyer jokes tonight about that whole thing and where they will be and so on. But the issue with it is how do you go and speak to your lawyer friends about Christ now?
Well, I have fewer lawyer friends now. I'm out of that commercial game, so I do teach at Sydney Uni, and I love being around the young students. Very vibrant environment. Yeah, you've got to in any form of evangelism. I find you've got to assess what sort of person you're talking to and where they sit before you start trying to make arguments. For some people, intellectual arguments are necessary. For other people, it's a far more emotional experience. Everyone comes in a different way.
So there's no like one size fits all then. There's no to say, well, I'm going to learn this method and then I'm going to knock on doors until, that method applies.
I've recently taken up street evangelism. I minister at my church in North Sydney. So I'm an evangelical Anglican. And we just go up to people. And I expected to be rebuffed and told in no uncertain terms to nick off by most people. It wasn't my experience. Many people wanted to talk. I mean, a few told you to get lost, but a lot of people wanted to talk. They'd come from some sort of faith background, a lot of Catholics, a lot of people who'd come from other countries, and talk about whatever they wanted to talk about.
So let's
So
talk.
they might say, for example, do you really believe in the resurrection? Do you really believe that? And I'd say, yes, I do. Here's why. All sorts of questions. Let your, rather than just lecturing people, let them ask you the questions and then respond.
Okay. So in a sense, what you're saying, we've got to kind of almost earn the right to talk to people by finding out a bit more about their context.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, find out about them. What's the barrier for you? Tell me. You know, you once a Christian and lapsed, or you just find it nonsense, or you have a bad experience. That's common.
So I mean, in your going up to people and talking about this, what would be the most common reason why people are not connecting to Christ?
Okay, among young people, in my opinion, sheer ignorance. They simply haven't been taught the basics of what the Christian religion is all about. Don't get it in state schools, despite the fact that religious education teachers, scripture, we used to call it, do a great job. Not getting it at school, even a lot of the so-called church schools, pretty token. So if you're not raised in a Christian family, you're simply not going to get that basic background knowledge. Up until probably the 60s and 70s, everyone got. Among older people, you might have that basic knowledge. There's a whole raft of reasons why the church no longer appeals. I often agree with them, the churches are terrible in many ways. But you've got to look at the centre of it, the magnificent centre of it, Christ.
So let's get to that in terms of God actually then. Because God actually, as you said earlier, was an apologetic. So the way I understand what apologetic means, that we're not apologizing for Christianity. What we try to do is to justify or say what we mean by Christianity and the connections with Christianity. Is that's what we're trying to do. So
to demonstrate why it's reasonable to believe in it.
Okay.
Of course, everyone ultimately has got to take their own personal leap of faith. That's not something that can be the subject of argument. That has to be a heart decision. But it helps to make that decision from a position of knowledge. And for existing believers, it's important that you be able to defend yourself when and if you're asked. 1 Peter 3:15, you must always be ready with an answer to anyone who asks you the reason for your hope.
So what you're really saying is that most people answer, I don't know.
I think most people give pretty lame reasons. I did at first. It's another reason I started to write that book. I realised my initial attempts to explain this weren't very good. I went through my own reasoning process.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, one of the chapters particularly deals with the concept of God in terms of love.
Yes.
And love is the central core of much of what you would understand in terms of the gospel. How would you define that relationship or that understanding of love?
One breakthrough for me was to conceptualize love as part of God's creation. It's God's greatest creation. When people talk about doctrines of creation, they often talk, fair enough, about the physical universe, the laws of physics and chemistry and how the universe began and how it's sustained and so on. That's all fine. That's fascinating for many men. But when you think about it, if there's a creator, God created love. And that's something everybody can associate with, love in all its forms. And Christ demonstrated it in a perfect way. So that chapter 3, has got all the forms of earthly love. And then asking the question, well, is love just an accident? That's the atheist view. Love's just an accident of mindless forces. Means nothing. That's not the way we live our lives. They're all the forms of love, and I'm not just talking about romantic love, of course, but mother and son, parent and child, brother and sister, all, and friends, all those forms. God created a world in which those feelings are the most important thing in our lives.
So one of the big things, of course, I know I've heard a lot of people respond to when we do an apologetic about God, is that if God is so good, why is there suffering?
Yeah, reading yet another book on that question. Cambridge University latest attempt. It's the ultimate question, of course. The ultimate difficult question. No one's ever come up with a complete answer. Chapter 7 of what actually is my attempt. Essentially, I think the answer is the old-fashioned one, which is Leibniz's answer. God created the best of all possible worlds. To make life meaningful, there has to be suffering. If humans free will, there has to be moral choice, therefore there has to be the potential for evil. Physical evil, hurricanes, famines and so on, harder, but similar argument to be made there. That does take a leap of faith, and that is very, when you're evangelising to people who've experienced extreme suffering, loss or war, survivors of awful crimes, that sort of thing. I feel like I'm almost reluctant to get into those arguments. It's better just to show love and compassion. The point in the chapters 38 to 42 of Job, the best statement in the Bible.
So the book you wrote, Post-God Nation, I'm interested that it's got a question mark at the end, because from that, the interpretation has to be that we're not really.
We are and we aren't. So the thesis of Post-God Nation, well, if you go back a step, I was asked by ABC Books, now owned by HarperCollins, to write a book explaining why, words of my commissioning editor, Christianity is doomed in Australia. What are the reasons for that? That's an interesting subject. I do think there are some big reasons why, as a percentage of the population, Christians are a shrinking minority. So at Federation, we have 96% of the population identifying as Christian, and about half the population attending church on Sunday. Now we're down to the next census. If the census due this year, I'm not sure what's going to happen, but I'm predicting here and now, the first time, the number of people who even identify nominally as Christian will be below 50% for the first time. The numbers attending church on a regular basis is under 10%. That's a huge change in Federation. The numbers were not terribly far from Federation as late as the 1960s. The fastest growing category is no religion. But the second half of my book is about why that is so. It's not just Australia, of course, it's the West in general. Christianity is booming in some other parts of the world, third world, second world, China. But it's dying in the West as a percentage of the population. Still very fervent Christians out there, isn't it? But I said to my editor, look, that's fine, but I've got to feel compelled to give both sides of the story, because Australia, the cliche, but Australia was created in 1788 as a Christian nation. The Indigenous story, the vital part of that, is very much layered into that. Until very recently, Indigenous Australians identified as Christian more than any other segment of the Australian community. It's a great evangelism story as well. First 5 chapters of Postcode Nation are about how Christianity shaped Australia in any way you want to know. Politics, law, exploration, science, agriculture, you name it. You name it. There's a Christian story, Indigenous relations especially. There's a Christian story there. There's obviously some terrible blunders and atrocities mixed in there. It's a sinful story as well, but it is a Christian story. And any attempt to rewrite that history is simply false and to be abhorred. In that respect, I'm on the conservative side of the culture. On many other issues, I'm on the, what would be called the far left side of the culture. If I just say I'm on the Christian side, depending on where the Bible leads me.
Okay. So in terms of that, when I was reading Postcard Nation, there's a sense that I got though, that if you scratch under the surface of even those who would maybe say no religion, you don't have to scratch very far to kind of get to a religious framework though.
No, you don't. The best example is, I thought of it when I came here, Uniting Church, okay, amalgamation, of course, the Presbyterian, Methodists and the congregation. The second book is a book about our prime ministers. Right, who were the great Congregationalists, Methodists? The one that sprang to mind was Bob Hawke, arguably Australia's greatest Labor Prime Minister. His father was a Congregationalist minister. Hawke himself, in later life, called himself an agnostic, but no doubt sincerely. But he said again and again and again, all his values were shaped by his father and his mother. They were very pious Christian faith, Congregationalist church. He always, his father's mantra was the brotherhood of God and the brotherhood of man. Everything he did shaped by those values. And he's just one example. John Howard was brought up in the Methodist Church, but he moved over to the Anglicans. Kevin Rudd belonged to virtually every church you can know. Some great stories there. Some great stories. I spoke to Howard and Rudd. I had 1.5 hours face to face with each of them, talking theology. Fascinating experience.
I can imagine.
Yeah.
I can imagine. So in terms of that, the whole.
Separately. They don't get on. Yeah.
No, I can imagine that too. But
And Howard got on. And Howard got on well.
But they were of a different era.
They were.
In terms of statesmen, weren't they?
Very, very.
Yeah. The question for me though is then, especially for us as congregations, where our congregations are getting older, our congregations are getting smaller. What can we do to arrest that decline? Or is there anything we can do?
I don't think we're going to see, I mean, it's ultimately in God's hands. It's vital to stress this. God can initiate a revival at any time. But I'm sure he wants Christians to do it. That's the mechanism that God's always used, using Christians to do it, rather than supreme it. But it is ultimately a matter of providence. However, if you look at the existing societal trends, the number is a little, no question about it. You've heard my prediction about the census. How low can we go? I don't know, but I will say this. We are living off Christian capital at the moment. If the West generally, and Australia in particular, is going to become a other than small pockets, irreligious country. We better be very sure we're going to replace it. Because the examples from around the world are terrible. What can we do? One thing I'm convinced of is this. Moderation is not the answer. Okay? Moderation in theology, moderation in approaches. I used to be a moderate. Increasingly, I've become a bullshit. No, seriously, in Paul's words, ultimately, the message of the gospel is foolishness for those who don't believe. You won't win people by watering down the apparent foolishness. You have to get people to believe it's true. That's the key. Once people believe it's true, they'll do anything. They'll die for it. History shows for 2,000 years. You know, the Soviet Union tried to stamp it out. The most brutal methods imaginable in the world. There's this paradox that the more complacent a society becomes, the more the faith seems to decline. And sure, immense wealth and prosperity is another big problem with faith in the world. Adversity, if anything, seems to be a spur to faith. You won't spread the faith by being timid, or trying to water it down. It has to be the full story. The churches that are growing are those that command the most of their members, expect the most, and say, I used not to believe this, but I do now. Because I've been in different church congregations, and the ones that are thriving are full of young people, and the message is crystal clear, very biblical.
We're going to come back to that message. We're going to take a short break and listen to a song. It's by a guy by the name of Jeremy Camp. Some of you may have heard of Jeremy Camp. He's a gospel singer, been around for quite a while. There was a movie about him and about his relationship just a while ago that came out. I'm not sure. I think it may have gone to video, but it's called "I Still Believe," and it really was about his first relationship, his first marriage, where he got married to what the love of his life, and within months found out that she found out that she had cancer, and 2 years later she died, and he then went into a tailspin, kind of saying, what do I believe now? I mean, how can this happen to me? And this particular song is a song that comes out of that period. It's called "I Still Believe." Let's listen to it together. We're going to continue with our little conversation, and I want to get to your fourth book, and that's one which a lot of people would actually remind ourselves about, because it's really about Arthur Stace, who was, of course, the one who we know of as used to write the graffiti of eternity. In fact, just about anywhere he could find an opportunity to do that. I think you say in your book that he did it something like 1 million times.
The estimate is 500,000.
Half a million times he wrote the word eternity. And from what I understand about it, it was that he was wanting people to think about it. He was wanting people to say, look, it's not all about here. What's going to happen for you in terms of eternity?
That's right. For Arthur, it was a one-word sermon. The one thing I have in common with Arthur Stace is that they're both midlife converts. I don't know if everyone's aware of the backstory, but for those who aren't, Arthur Stace was a man who was born in Sydney in 1885 into dire working class poverty. He spent the first 35 years of his life quintessential Aussie battler. He lived through both depressions, both world wars. He was fostered out as a child. His parents and siblings were drunks. He descended into the criminal underworld. Converted to Barnabas Church on Broadway at the height of the Depression, 1930. He devoted the rest of his life to Christianity. And his way of doing it was to go around the streets of Sydney writing the one word, eternity, and chalk on the paper, chalk or crayon. He did it every day, 35 years. That was what he said, and there's no reason to disbelieve it. I was asked to write this book, and I knew a little about it, but I didn't know the full story by any means. And I set out to try and be sceptical. But the story, it's a classic example of truth is stranger than fiction. You couldn't have made it up. It really, it's like the Gospels. You could not make the story up. And that's why it's so powerful. This man who ultimately reached billions of people, literally. You'll remember New Year's Eve 1999, the word appeared on the Harbour Bridge. It telecast to 2 billion people around the world. It was Sydney entered the new millennium before any other comparable big city in the world. So everyone around the world was watching our coverage. And Arthur's word was on the bridge. Let's get back to your question. Yes, that was his aim. He used to say in his gravelly old voice, you've got to face it. You've got to face it. Everyone's got to think about it.
Wow.
Yeah.
He died the year before I was born. So it's an interesting concept in terms of when he died, because he died.
I'm allowed to say what you got.
1967. So yeah, that's you are. I've got. I won't deal with my weight, but yes. So as far as my age is not a problem. 1967, which was actually quite a big time for evangelicalism in some ways. It was a period. It was kind of the I mean, Billy Graham was still doing his thing and all of that kind of thing happening. I mean, in some ways, does the word eternity do much for young people today?
Well, I hope it does, because in conjunction with some Christian filmmakers, we're making a movie about it. And one of our aims is to try and bring it to a new generation, explain it. But the beauty of the word, of course, was that it appealed to Christians across the board, but it also appealed to people who weren't believers. It had this resonance. By the time of his death, Arthur attracted a cult following. He was known by everyone in Sydney. He'd been outed in 1956, and some of you may remember, he became quite a cult figure in his own way in the last 10 years of his life. Then the legend died down somewhat. It was revived in the 1990s, and there are now lots of paintings based on Arthur. There's an opera about Arthur. There's a couple of movies. There's poems. His T-shirts. He's scored this whole industry. And the word that was been trademarked by the city of Sydney. True story. True story. Frank Sartor slapped the trademark just after the year 2000. It's valuable. Restaurants in town. I started up a walking tour, all of Arthur's favourite spots. It's just such an inspirational story for a couple of reasons. One is the word itself. By the way, he took it from the King James version of the Bible. Isaiah 57:15. Where God himself is described as he who inhabits eternity. He who inhabits eternity. Arthur heard a real old-time preacher did a sermon on that verse, and that's what inspired him to his mission for 35 years. The word itself is magical and resonant. But Arthur's story is this hopeless run. Complete no hope. Converted, and became just a man everyone loved, everyone who came in contact with. In very senior ministers, everyone by the end loved him. He never forgot his roots. He did enormous charitable work, and he was poor as a church mouse. He had any money. marry late in life. A beautiful romance mixed into his story. And
Sounds almost like a Hollywood movie,
it
really.
is. Yeah, well, seriously, we're trying to put something together. Yeah,
Okay.
great Australian story.
Well, I think one thing about being an immigrant is that I never quite understand the Australian psyche, but one thing the Australian likes are the people who kind of the underdogs.
Yeah.
I mean, we like the Ned Kellys and the so on, and I think Arthur seems to
Rodonicus.
well amongst others, yeah, that's right. But it seems as if almost as if Arthur fits into that kind of type
Perfect example.
of the underdog who comes good.
The underdog who comes good, fights all the odds. No frills, no nonsense. Authentic, to use the woke word, that he was. And everyone could see that. I spent a lot of time with co-author, her parents knew Arthur very well, Baptist, pastor. And they tried to explain why do the journalists love him so much. Because Australian journalists can pick out a famous almost immediately. And they loved Arthur because he obviously wasn't famous. Many religious spokespeople are, so he got great press.
Oh, fantastic.
Christian churches could learn a lot from his example.
No, I think certainly what you said earlier about evangelism, and certainly I think my congregation would appreciate it if my sermons only had one word.
Interestingly, he tried a few other things. This is less well known. He tried obey God. He tried Jesus saves and a few other things, and they didn't work. They didn't work. He kept. Arthur, just stick to your eternity. Just had a way he wrote this beautiful copper plate script. What Arthur trademark. And we found out in my researches where Arthur went to write that. There's a myth that he was never schooled and was illiterate. Some sort of literally a miracle. That isn't. When he was fostered out at the age of 7, he went to live in Goulburn with a widow in the 1890s. With the Goulburn public schools for 2 years. That's where he went to live.
Oh well, so there's a feather in Goulburn Public Schools cap.
Yeah, I'm very proud of it.
I can believe that. Well, thank you very much for that, Roy. That was wonderful, and particularly in terms for us, I think the word that I'm taking back is that word authentic. I think what you've been writing about, in fact, in all the books, whether it be about the prime ministers, whether it be about apologetic, or whatever it is that word authentic kind of comes through. Is that if we
really live it, or is it just?
Just something that you put on Sundays.
Yeah.
It's not going to work, is it? Then it needs to be something. Yeah, it needs to be something we live every day. Yeah. Well, thank you very much for reminding about that and for the connections with it. And you brought some books with you. So for those who are here today, if you want to buy a book and get it autographed, whatever, you can certainly do that. But it's great to have had you here. And thank you very much for coming. If you can give me a hand. I just want to respond to that and apologizing to talk to the camera, but the reality of it is that I want to respond to what we've just heard and some of what I've read over the last couple of weeks, particularly in reminding myself of Roy's books. And the thing that got to me, or the thing that came into my mind, was 1 Corinthians 13. Now, I think the reason for that, of course, is because I did a wedding recently, and they asked for 1 Corinthians 13. And 1 Corinthians 13 finishes with the line, and these three remain: faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love. And I think it must be my favorite passage in the whole Bible. I like what comes before it as well. And if you've not looked at it, I would encourage you to do so. But I love that passage. And it was explained to me by a professor from Yale University. He was at a preaching conference, and I was at that conference, and he explained to me about that word remain. These three remain. And the original Greek means these three remain even past death. So when I was thinking about that word eternity, essentially what it said to me is that if God is in eternity, then what else is there? And in terms of Paul, he says what's going to be there is faith, hope, and love. And that those three things, if that's the three things that are going to be in eternity, then those are the three things that we should be living out on earth, that we should be living out today. That we should live out faith, that we should live out our belief. That, as Roy said, that we in fact stop watering it down, stop trying to make it acceptable and say, this is actually what I believe. I'm not going to apologize for it. I'm actually going to acknowledge this is what it is. And not because I'm going to ram it down anybody else's throat, but to say that this is what I believe. And out of what I believe comes my hope, my sense that in fact, I can live today in the hope of what will happen tomorrow. That in fact, I can live in eternity now, not just in what's going to come. And then how do I do that? Well, love. And as Roy talked about, the concepts of love, that God's love, the love that we see in the Bible, the word agape, is a special love, but it's a love that enables all the other loves that we have. All the other kinds of earthly loves that we have actually are reflections of that love that God has for us. A love which is without condition, without compromise. And one, therefore, that I don't have to try and force anybody to have. I don't have to try and force somebody to love me. I don't have to force myself to love them. Because the truth of it is that love is something that comes from God himself. And so those three remain: faith, hope, and love. Absolutely. And that's where we get to it. And so I want to encourage you that as we think about eternity, as we think about people like Arthur Stace and that one-word sermon, that in fact maybe we would have three words: faith, hope, and love, written in beautiful copper plate, but actually put upon our hearts and thought about for eternity. And we're going to reflect on that now. Just in a short time, just as we listen to music, you'll see the words come up. And as you see the words come up, just let's reflect on what it means for us to actually live those words out in the world that we're in today. Let's do that now.